I'm Andra Watkins. I'm a New York Times bestselling author of the memoir Not Without My Father, One Woman's 444-Mile Walk of the Natchez Trace, and some other books. But last year, I started writing about Project 2025 on Substack. My Substack was called How Project 2025 Will Ruin Your Life. And I wrote about it from the perspective of having grown up in Christian nationalism and escaped. And I called Project 2025 a Christo-Fascist manifesto to turn our democracy into a Christian nationalist theocracy. So from January of 2024 until the election in November, I broke down Project 2025 from that perspective. I usually like to give people a little bit of my personal background. I grew up in South Carolina, so if you can't tell by now, I'm not from Ohio. And so I grew up in a church and school that was one of the founding members of Jerry Falwell Sr.'s Moral Majority. So it was one of those segregationist schools that got started in the South after the civil rights initiatives and amendments, where white parents didn't want to send their children to school with Black children. So churches started these schools, and my parents sent me to one of them starting in kindergarten. So I was indoctrinated in the underpinnings of what undergirds Project 2025 from kindergarten to 12th grade. And I went to Jerry Falwell Sr.'s Liberty University my freshman year of college. So while there are different flavors of Christian nationalism, and we can talk about that some as part of this, I was very much indoctrinated in the Baptist Protestant version of it. And so it really was an experience for me to pick up Project 2025 and start reading it and not be very many pages in and start seeing Bible verses buried in the text that I read and memorized when I was a kid. And I read them out to my husband, who grew up Catholic. And he was like, I never would have known that was from the Bible. So I persevered and read all 900 and something pages of this thing and marked it up and decided to write a Substack to warn people about not necessarily the Christian nationalism in it, though I did write about that, but I grew up in that world. So I understand the world they want to create with this document and how oppressive and limiting it is. So I wanted to warn people about how these proposals and policy positions could ruin their lives and impact their lives in ways that they probably couldn't even imagine.
Well, and that's one of the things that drew me to your work initially, was this sense of the decoding that you were doing, and how, we'll get back to that in a minute. But I think one of the first things I would like you to do is to tell us the difference between mainstream Christianity and what you see as Christo-Fascist. Because I love that term, and I think it's very provocative. But I think there's a distinction you make.
Yeah. So mainstream Christianity are largely people who just love Jesus and maybe like to talk about him. They might tell you about him a little more than you're comfortable with, but they're overall people who just want to help other people, serve other people, lift other people up, live the example that Jesus himself set in his life and ministry of choosing the least of people and helping them and supporting them and lifting them up. That's more Christians than not, quite frankly. Christian nationalists really use Jesus as what I'm going to use a Christian nationalist term. They use him as a fire escape. They believe in him for their salvation, to escape hell, the fires of hell. But they really worship vengeful, angry Old Testament God. And vengeful, angry Old Testament God is the God that loved to smite cities because they displeased him. He's the God who ordered people to be stoned to death for violating various 10 commandments. He's the God who loved for people to call out and execute and persecute witches and loose women and anyone who was sexually promiscuous. So he very much judged sexual promiscuity, and we can talk about that some as it relates to Project 2025 in a bit. But he was very much a manly God, and that's really relevant to the news today. He wasn't this old beardy man sitting on a cloud. He was a steroid-fueled monster beast of a man God who loved to smite everyone and then go tell inappropriate jokes with his male buddies over beers after he burned Sodom and Gomorrah to the ground because of the gay people. So, that is the kind of God that they worship. So it's a very different vision of God from what mainstream Christianity has of God. And you even see that coming out now in some of these town halls and public events where they're bringing up Christianity, and Christians are saying, I don't worship that God. That's not my God. I don't want to have anything to do with that God. So that's very much the kind of God they worship.
Yeah, and I've talked to others who say that's the type of God that led to January 6th, where we have to take it back, right?
Well, I was a child in South Carolina. I was probably 7, 8 years old the first time my pastor said that I might someday have to take up arms and fight and kill other Americans for my right to worship Jesus. So this notion of Christians as holy warriors, as soldiers of God, onward Christian soldiers, the battle hymn of the Republic, it's all, we are God's army, has been indoctrinated into various Christian nationalist congregations on the Protestant side, at least since I was a child. On the Catholic side, with the Opus Dei crowd and some of their far-right sects, which is all part of this, even though they don't agree on who's going to heaven. But they all work together right now to, seize power. So on the Catholic side, they were the original crusaders. So, this notion of fighting and dying to either bring people back into the one true faith or kill people who refuse to accept the one true faith is a really old notion on this planet.
Yeah, and maybe because I know you're working on this now in your Substack, maybe you could give us a breakdown of some of the different types of, I guess, denominations or the groups that you've kind of highlighted in your work of the Christian nationalists. So you might stay, but the others do.
So I divide them into 3 groups. We could probably put subgroups in there and maybe even make a 4th group. But they're the Opus Dei Catholics. And a lot of Opus Dei money and brain power fueled the writing of Project 2025. Kevin Roberts, who was the president of the Heritage Foundation when it was commissioned, is affiliated with Opus Dei. Roger Severino, who wrote the Health and Human Services section of Project 2025 on issues like contraception and abortion and the NIH and the CDC, is affiliated with Opus Dei. J.D. Vance is affiliated with Opus Dei. So Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas, I would say that all the male Supreme Court justices probably are as well. So they're a very powerful bloc that's largely been bankrolled by Leonard Leo, who's also affiliated with them. So they have been very smart and have been working for a long time, capturing the judiciary, getting people into positions of really powerful power to impact their worldview, and their worldview is the only people who are going to heaven are Catholics. And everyone else are heretics. Everyone else is going to hell. And we have to force everyone to either accept Catholicism and come back to the one true faith, or we'll just kill them all. We don't care. So there's that. And I even did a Substack Live last night with someone who talked about how in private they talk about their Catholic king. They believe that we should go back to this feudal structure where a Catholic monarchy is aligned with religion and the church, and we're all serfs. So that's Opus Dei. The Baptist version of it, the Protestant version that I grew up in, the poster person for that I drag out is a man named Dusty Devers, who is an Oklahoma State representative. He is a Baptist minister, and he is also in the Oklahoma State legislature. And he is an abortion absolutist. You know, he wants to ban all abortion absolutely. He constantly uses his seat in the legislature to propose Christian nationalist laws. So he was the first person who proposed doing away with no-fault divorce in a state. So when you heard about that, that was Dusty Devers who proposed that piece of legislation that did not pass. So then he came back and proposed a covenant marriage law this year, which is also Christian nationalist language for a real marriage, a moral marriage, a moral marriage, a normal marriage. It's not really anything other than a Christian nationalist construct to not say what they're really saying, which is a lot of what they do in all of these camps. And because people outside of those camps have never bothered to learn what they mean when they say things, it just goes right over people's heads, and people don't call them out on it. So though that camp is affiliated with other Protestant groups, Presbyterian, the PCA, Presbyterians would be probably loosely affiliated with them. Some smatterings of other Protestants would be affiliated with them. Some non-denominational folks could be affiliated with them as well. Joel Webbin is a non-denominationalist pastor in Texas who called for women who falsely accused men of sexual assault to be publicly stoned to death. So he and Dusty Devers collaborated to write their statement on Christian nationalism and what they believe our Christian nationalist theocracy should look like. So they're both just lovely, lovely people. And then we have the New Apostolic Reformation, the Dominionist crowd, who are largely sprung from, Church of God, charismatic, Pentecostal divisions within Christianity. So and not all of them do this. I don't want to generalize, but generally they speak in tongues, they faith heal. It's a more effusive and loud and very demonstrative way of worshiping than I was ever comfortable with. And so the Dominionists follow the Seven Mountain Mandate. They believe that they are charged to take over the whole world for Jesus before Jesus can return. And so they must force everyone to accept their version of Christianity. And we should all submit to that worldwide before Jesus can return and create this utopia on earth. The most notable recent example of someone like that was the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, who used Dominionist language heavily in his opinion that IVF should not be allowed. So he's an example of someone who's conquered his mountain, and now he's using all of his crazy and all of his rulings. And the Opus Dei crowd and the Dominionist crowd hide that. They're instructed to not be so overt about their faith until they get to where they can, make a difference. The Baptists are just sanctimonious and awful all the time. So they can't stop talking about it. So those are the three main strings of it. I mean, people have said we could put Mormons in this, we could put Jehovah's Witnesses in this, but all of these crowds would say, all the main three would say, no, 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 those are all not real Christians. They're all cults. That doesn't have anything to do with us. We don't want to have anything to do with them. I mean, we'll fight culture wars with them, but otherwise, no, they're absolutely not going to heaven. So I don't really put them in Christian nationalism because the three main drivers of it wouldn't. But those also do exist, and they do use these same kinds of tactics to try to achieve their own means of theocratic control.
So one of the, thank you for that, because that's a great breakdown of what's going on. But one of the things that I've noticed when I talk to people about this, who don't really understand this is happening, don't believe it is happening. So they just don't understand that there's this organizational drive and very intentional push to make this happen. And when I say this, the salvation of America, the transformation of our society into their visions. So what do you say, before we get into Project 2025, what do you say to people when you're explaining this to them and they kind of push back and say, that's just a small group, it's crazy, you're just being hyperbolic?
Well, people have said that to me I mean, that's largely what I heard for most of last year. It does not make me feel good now to go, oh, I wrote this on this date last year and here it is happening. Oh, I wrote this on this date and here it is happening. But I was crazy and I was hyperbolic, but here it is happening. So I have a little more credibility now because so much of what I predicted has already come to pass. I mean, I probably wasn't crazy enough with some of my predictions, to be honest. But I wanted people to believe me and I wanted to make them accessible. But, most people were just like, this will never happen. This can never happen in America. And I think that's part of the problem. Americans have never lived under an oppressive regime in our lifetimes. Certainly pre-Civil War, Civil War, post-Civil War, there were some oppressive regimes. Peoples of color have lived under an oppressive regime in this country. I'm not saying that there aren't people who have not suffered horribly, because there are. Indigenous peoples were robbed of their lands. There are people who have suffered horribly, but white people haven't. And so, there are just a lot of people who don't think that anything will change, no matter how many times you tell them that democracy is a tenuous thing, that it takes daily maintenance and daily investment and daily work to keep it going. And so now we find ourselves here. And, really at this point, I don't have any Trumpy people in my life anymore. I made every effort that I could with the few I had left, couldn't convert any of them. Haven't heard from any of them since the election. So, I'm not in a mode of trying to convert them anymore. I'm more gratified that my Substack has exploded since the election, and I'm helping people prepare to live in a country that's going to be very different. And because of how right I was, a lot of these people really listen to me now and don't go, oh, that won't happen. They're like, I'm getting rid of my Gmail. I'm getting rid of Google Drive. I'm getting a secure email account. I maybe won't use WhatsApp anymore. I'm getting rid of my Facebook. So that's gratifying. I just wish people had done it. I wish they'd had that reaction a year ago.
One of the things, like, I wanted to do a whole program on 2025 here, and everyone was like, oh, that's not a thing. No one's talking about it anymore. And now it's thundered back into our lives in a way that, as you said, it laid it bare, right?
The way they designed Project 2025 was very strategic and really perfect for what they were trying to accomplish. I mean, I have it over here. It is this thick. When I printed it to mark it all up, and I need like 5 different clips to hold it together. It is dense and boring, and they front loaded a lot of the really dense, boring stuff so that you'd put it down and not read it. It's also tailored to a country where 54% of American adults don't read at a 6th grade level. It's not written at a 6th grade level. It's written at probably an 8th to 10th grade level. You know, it is a government document with a lot of jargon and legalese in it. So, you know, somebody who reads at a 6th grade level is not going to be able to wade through that thing. And that is by design. And then when you try to explain it, I could never break it down to a 4th grader. That was not my skill set. I was just trying to say, this is what this could do to you. And I thought that might resonate with people. You know, they're going to outlaw all contraception because they believe all contraception causes abortions. Oh, that won't ever happen. Okay. So I thought those kinds of examples would be more resonative, but no. So here we are now.
So let's get into, because you do a really good job of explaining it. So thank you for that. And you did a really good job too of breaking down what the Christian nationalist agenda is in the document. So if you look at it and you think, oh, this is just policy wonkism, right? This is just for the politicians. But it's also for an audience that can decode it like you decode it. So could you tell us what Project 2025 is doing specifically for and by Christian nationalists?
Project 2025 uses a definition of morality that is biblical morality. So they define morality when they use that word. Every time you see that word, it is what we think the Bible means about morality and how we interpret what is moral based on our Bibles. And so you don't know that when you read it, but then you start reading through it, and they believe that there are only 2 sexes, one man and one, like man and woman. And they've already made that proclamation and made a lot of changes in the government based on that. But, they believe that everything humanity needed to know about everything is contained in the Bible. That is all God meant for us to know about anything. And so that's one reason why they're so skeptical of scientists and experts and people who have education, because those people are taught to think critically. They're taught to use methods that do not reside in the Bible. And so therefore it is all heresy and apostasy and very Middle Ages kind of thinking. These people would have been the people who burned scientists at the stake in the Middle Ages for being heretics, because, what they were purporting was not in the Bible and couldn't be explained with the Bible. So therefore it was heresy. So this group of Christian nationalists very much feels that way about the Bible. So since Adam and Eve, the story of creation, is what happened, it is 100% the truth. That is the science of how we got here. According to them, that literally happened. God created Adam, and then he created Eve from Adam's rib, and that really happened. There were no other sexes. God doesn't make mistakes. He created one man and one woman and told them to be fruitful and multiply. And so therefore there are no other sexes. There are no other genders. That is the end. That is what God proclaimed. God did not create Adam and Steve. He created Adam and Eve. My pastor as a child said that all the time. So, that is where they get that from. That is where that executive order is drawn from. That is where all of these changes in transgender policy have come from. It is from the creation story in the Bible.
Yeah, and I found an article where you break out some of the parts of Project 25. I'd love for you to, I'm going to read it here, and maybe you could give us some idea of what is actually being done. So this is about dismantling the administrative state, and it says the next conservative president must possess the courage to relentlessly put the interests of the everyday American over the desires of the ruling elite. Their outrage cannot be prevented. It must simply be ignored. And
we're seeing that now, aren't we?
Right.
That stems from their belief, Christian nationalists, whatever their persuasion, believe that if there is a law that man writes that violates their interpretation of the Bible, then they are ordered by God to rewrite that law to reflect their interpretation of the Bible. And they can disobey that law. They can fight against that law. They can attack that law. They can undermine that law. They can do whatever they want to with the human law that they believe violates the Bible without displeasing God. And so that is what that statement really means. We are going to drag this nation into making laws that jibe with our interpretation of the Bible. And they're outraged. They're going to be mad, but God told us to do this. We are doing this on behalf of God's orders, and we are right. And so we can just ignore them. And so that's really what they're saying.
Well, it's interesting, too, this play of elites, because if you have the president, that's the definition of an elite. And they are, in some ways, the elite. But when they use the word in the over the desires of the ruling elite, who are they talking about? Are they talking about the bureaucrats, or are they talking about?
Okay. Yeah. Well, I was indoctrinated to hate scientists, university professors, and college education generally. Liberals of all stripes. The media was all just a cesspool of liberal, horrible people. Most of government was a bunch of liberals. So, whether they were politicians or civil servants, they were all the same kind of bad. So those were the people who were defined as elites for me, plus Hollywood, the arts, creators. My mother didn't police me a whole lot in terms of what I read as a child. I was very grateful that I broke like 2 library cards when they had those, ink that they would run it through. So, I was a very big reader as a child, even though I didn't read broadly about history or anything like that until I was an adult. But, they don't want libraries to have information where people can really learn anything to think critically. They don't want people to be taught that. And they've been working at that for decades. So, and we see the outcome of that kind of work and how Americans, many of them can't think critically anymore. And they can't read, and they can't, parse, is this true? And how do I figure it out? So that's a direct result of that.
Yeah, and that leads to the next quote I had, which was, it goes on to say that the intellectual sophistication, advanced degrees, financial success, blah, blah, blah. And then it goes into, it is open to us to read in the book of human nature, to which we are all offered the key just by merit of our shared humanity.
And the book of human nature is the Bible.
Yeah.
But they're not going to call it that. So they call it the book of human nature. That's their code word for it.
And that goes on to say that the American political life is that everyone who can read in that book must have a voice in deciding the course and fate of our republic.
As long as they accept the Christian Nationalist interpretation of that book. they can have a voice. Otherwise, they will not. And we're already seeing that play out as well, with some of these decisions that have already been handed down. And it's not just going to be trans people who are suffering, even though they're on the front lines. I mean, women have been suffering now since Roe was overturned, and women are suffering and they're dying, and you know, it's a huge population of people who are being put through inhuman treatment and having their personal autonomy and bodily autonomy taken away from them. But, you know, this is a very binary thought process and a very patriarchal, I hate to use that word, but it is, you know, Christian nationalists believe that men are the leaders and women belong at home submitting to their husbands and mothering the children, and they don't need to work, and they don't need to own anything, and they don't need to have any independence from their husbands. And that's what I was groomed to do. And you know, I mean, I thankfully went to college because I was a valedictorian in my graduating class. I worked very hard and studied very hard, trying to make my parents proud of me. And all they ever would say is, well, we don't expect you to be anything. But, you know, when maybe you should major in accounting, because when you marry your good Christian husband and have children and they go back to school, you could do something part-time if you wanted to. But, you know, that was the mentality that I grew up in. So it's a miracle that I've accomplished anything in my life, because I was not programmed to expect to have a career as a woman. And I did marry my good Christian husband the first time when I was very young. Thankfully, did not have children with him. He was abusive, and I divorced him. And that sort of started me out of that road. But it's a really hard set of programming to overcome if that's all you know, and that's all you've ever known. And that's what they want to take us back to, is this notion of marry as young as you can, have as many lily white babies as you can, no contraception, no birth control, no abortion, no intervention if the mother is dying, because if she dies, that's God's will. And, you know, it's a woman's calling to suffer. You know, Eve sinned first. So, you know, if women die in childbirth, that's just part of God's curse to Eve for being such a harlot. So, you know, that is very much the belief system of people like J.D. Vance. And you can even look at the things that he says and see that belief system embedded within the things that he says.
Yeah, and did Project 2025 have anything to say about USAID or the DEI that we're seeing?
DEI was criticized all over it. You know, they were going to strip all of that out of everything. So but you know, I didn't see them using it as a means to fire a bunch of people. They constantly said that they were going to strip that out of Biden administration policies and handbooks and websites and whatever, but I didn't see them using it as kind of a purity test to fire people, which they're clearly doing. But also, you know, they had a whole section on USAID, and it's really curious to me. A lot of Christian religious organizations get money from USAID and do work all over the world. It's kind of like they can get the federal government to fund their missionary outreach. And so I won't be surprised to see it come back in some other iteration where they're giving money solely to Christian groups that agree to spread Christian nationalist propaganda all over the planet and tend to things that Christian nationalists believe need to be tended to, which are not women's reproductive health, which are not HIV/AIDS, which, you know, but would be other things that they think are important. That won't surprise me at all. They didn't call for doing away with it. They called for a severe restructuring of it. And so that's why I say this doing away with it, I think, is a stage in the restructuring it.
Yeah, I'm reading the DEI stuff as part of the white nationalist agenda, kind of butting heads with the Christian nationalist agenda and overlapping when they're similar.
Oh, no, you shouldn't read it that way. Christian nationalists are white supremacists also. I mean, my pastor in South Carolina taught from the pulpit that Black people were cursed by God because Noah's grandson got him drunk and laughed at him, and so God cursed him. And so therefore, all of, they deserve to be treated in an inferior way. I mean, they use that to justify enslaving people. So it did not die just because the South lost the Civil War. They still kept preaching that crap from their pulpits. And there are still loads and loads of Christian nationalist people who believe that and would tell you that if they thought nobody would overhear them. So Christian nationalists align with white supremacists so well because they are white supremacists.
Yeah, and as you say, this indoctrination starts at birth for someone like you. But how did your parents get into it? Were they raised in this as well, or did this something they came to out of some other drive or
Christian? Well, any kind of cult. Let's just take a step back. Any kind of cult preys on broken people. And so, whatever cult-like technology they're selling, they need broken people who feel like they need something more or something different to get their lives together. So both of my parents, and I mean, I love my parents. I wrote a memoir about my dad and my relationship with him. And, they're still in all this, and it breaks their heart for me to talk about all this. And I don't talk to them anymore over all this stuff, but they both came from very difficult backgrounds. They both had very dysfunctional parents and dysfunctional kinds of situations and things that they survived. And so when they moved to South Carolina, I was 4. And they were looking for a church, and having this school where they didn't have to send me to school with Black people was one of the ways that the church would pull people in. And so that family, that sense of belonging, that sense of I feel seen here, and I've never felt that way before. My family is dysfunctional, so maybe this can be my family, is very much what appealed to both of my parents, I think. Initially, when I was really small, we were Presbyterian. I was christened in the Presbyterian church, and we went to church sometimes. It wasn't a big part of our lives. It was really when we moved to South Carolina and started going to that church. And it didn't happen immediately. It took several years before we were in church Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. My dad ran a bus route. My mom taught Sunday school. My mom sang in the choir. We were doing choir practices. Mom worked in Jolly 60s, and we were just there every day. So, but it didn't happen immediately. So, Christian nationalism needs more broken people. Churches are dying because not enough Americans are broken enough to need them. And so, part of what Christian nationalist Republicans are trying to engineer is a nation full of broken people with a lot of these policy positions that will rob Medicaid recipients of their health care and their food benefits, and that will rob veterans of their disability benefits and their health care through the VA, and will hopefully not, but rob elderly people of their Social Security and rob elderly people of their Medicare to help them stay in their nursing homes. And, the more people suffer, Christian nationalists believe, the more likely they will be to turn to the one true God and accept what they're selling. So, that's very much what drew my parents to it.
Well, yeah, it's incredibly, that makes a lot of sense when you say it that way, the punishing nature of it to increase the.
I mean, my mom's from Eastern Kentucky. So, Eastern Kentucky, probably know about it. I mean, she lived in Ohio, Southern Ohio, for part of her childhood. So, I have family all over Ohio. So I know that part of the country because I would spend time there, not too far from where it just recently flooded growing up. That was where she was from. So
yeah, and that's a section of the country that is, prospers, then declines, and then prospers and declines. And there's never like a consistent security there. It's always up. So that causes a lot of stress for people and families. But so here we are, about a month in. what is there?
It feels like years, doesn't it?
Doesn't it?
It feels like it's been years.
So what is coming briefly, and what can we do to stop it, but more importantly, remain sane as things move forward and more chaos and regardless of your political stripe, all of this is designed to be stressful to everyone. So we're all suffering under this. So what do we do?
All of the outrage theater that is being played out right now, I ignore all that. I really don't read the news. I don't care about tariffs and Greenland and we're red, white, and blue land or whatever they want to call it. So much of that is just theater. What Elon Musk is doing is transforming the government for a weak, pathetic Republican Party who didn't have the will to do it on their own and doesn't want to be blamed for it. So they're going to sit and let him do it and let him take the blame for it while they just go, I didn't, I mean, they're Congress. They could stop it anytime they wanted to, but they're not going to. So I have been telling my readers, the only thing these politicians pay attention to is phone calls. And that is from a senior level staffer of a senator. You can email, you can fill out forms, you can sign petitions, but the only things they pay attention to are showing up in their offices, coming to a town hall and dealing with them in person, or calling them. And so I have been telling my readers to use fivecalls.org and call their senator and their congresspeople every day and let them know they're unhappy about something this administration is doing. Don't say the same thing every day, because this Senate person also said if you say the same thing 5 times in a row, they're going to count that as one thing or one contact. So you want to have multiple contacts talking about different things. I also have been telling people to call your state attorney general's office, to call your local and state representatives and let them know how unhappy you are. They need to be hearing from us every day. And that is the biggest thing. If you cannot go to their offices and get in their faces, like Americans are starting to do, and say, what is going on? Boo, we didn't vote for Elon Musk to be our president. We're not happy. And that's not just a Republican or Democrat thing. Both sides of the aisle have unhappiness about that. So ruby red districts have people showing up and expressing their unhappiness about that. So that's the thing that I've been telling people to do the most. I do believe that this administration has a plan to institute some sort of martial law over protest. And so I'm always reticent to tell people to protest with their bodies, though that's necessary. But I've been encouraging people to protest with their dollars and with their attention. And so, and not in on the 28th of February, we're not going to spend any money for a day. No, just don't spend any money that you don't have to spend, period, for as long as you can get away with it. If you can take a couple of weeks and just not go to work as a strike so that things will grind slowly down, then do that if you can afford to do that. A lot of people can't. I encouraged people to join indivisible groups or form community groups where they could figure out where are the vulnerable people in our communities, who is going to be impacted first by these changes, so that we can make sure those people have food and they have shelter and they have health care, and we're getting them what they need as this administration pulls back basic things for just humane things that we should be having. So outrage is a waste of time. If you're not doing something every day to combat that outrage, then it's doing exactly what they designed it to do to you. So every day I get up and I do something to try to make a difference. And I don't know whether it will make a difference. My success or failure here is not about, if anybody looked at my Project 2025 work, they would say that I failed because they won and nobody listened to me. And, but that's not how I define success. I prepared a lot more people for this than would have been prepared otherwise. There are a lot more Americans who understand what's happening now because of me. And that is a success. And so, if I hadn't opened my mouth, if I didn't try, if I didn't make that call, that's where we fail. And so telling ourselves this won't make a difference, telling ourselves we're already defeated, telling ourselves I'm not going to say anything because nobody will listen to me, are the exact thoughts that this regime is designing this just tsunami of outrage.
Where can we find your work? How can people connect with you? Because, everything you said resonates, but at the same time, I think you've been incredibly successful in getting your message out. The writing is fantastic, and I would love for people to be more engaged with your work. So where are you? And
I am on Substack. My Substack now is called For Such a Time as This, which is a biblical reference from the book of Esther. She was my favorite Bible character. And so I changed the name the day after the election from How Project 2025 Will Ruin Your Life to For Such a Time as This. And I do a mix on Substack 5 days a week of writing about Christian nationalism, trying to help people understand Christian nationalist language, their motivations, recognizing the different factions when they see them, and so forth. I also occasionally talk about Project 2025 or now, but it's not really fun to go, here's why I wrote about that, and now here they're doing it. And so I'm letting other people track how they're doing Project 2025. I just really didn't want to sit and do that every day. It feels very self-defeating. And I've also been giving people concrete action steps to take to protect themselves from living in a fascist regime. So last week I did several different posts about getting rid of Gmail, about finding European alternatives for US digital products that might be more secure in the event that there's a government crackdown on American companies who would kiss the ring and be complicit in cooperating with them. I had an immigration attorney come on and give an event to talk about ways to leave the US if you're in a vulnerable population. She works with vulnerable populations to help them land in a country that will be more favorable to their specific vulnerability. And so I had her come on and give a seminar for my readers about, because there are certainly Americans who should be thinking about doing that. And so those are the kinds of things I write about now 5 days a week at Substack.
Well, thank you for your work. It's impressive and incredibly important. And thank you for this interview as well.